Hey, I see there are a few people trickling in. I'll probably give it another minute or two before I start, just so that the other sessions can end and people can kind of find their place. Um, but yeah, for everyone that's already here, thanks for taking your time out of your day just to come hang out with us here at the conference and maybe get some insight or learn something that can help out your programs. Looking forward to sharing this with you. Yeah, so we'll just give it a few more minutes here. All right. Yeah, let's get started. So this is the session about fostering growth in esports athletes. My name is Ben Bruce. I am the former coach slash esports director at Barrington High School. I just left recently because I moved away. So currently, I am a freelance high school esports topics presenter. And yeah, we'll start going into this. A little bit about me before we start. In college, I studied industrial engineering. It's not like mechanical or chemical or anything like that. It's a very general degree where you focus on, not the product and all the details and intricacies with that, but you focus on the process, how things are made, supply chain, and management in general. It's all about creating systems, being efficient. So that's what I studied in college. And then I graduated. I worked as a project engineer, consulting for some companies in Chicago. So I do a lot of random project management or engineering work for pharma companies. And then the company I'm with currently here in Peoria is pharmaceutical equipment manufacturer. So now I manage projects and sell the equipment to former clients. And while I've been doing that, I've also been running esports programs. So when I was in college, um, I wasn't really into esports or really competitive gaming at all until my senior year of high school. And then I went away to college and began to really get into it. I wasn't great. But I played a lot of League of Legends, a lot of Counter Strike in college, and I knew that I wasn't good enough to play. But I watched a lot of esports, and I knew that I could coach. I had the ideas, and my sophomore year of college, I put a team together at Mizzou, and we competed. For the next 4 years, I was leading the program there at Mizzou for League of Legends. My last semester there was a youth development program slash like esports center called Yukatsu, and they ran a local LAN league for the 4 high schools. So every Wednesday and Friday night, the high schools were out there competing in person with their parents, friends, family watching. And it was an awesome experience. I ended up getting to coach one of the high schools there in Columbia. And that's kind of where I got involved with high school esports. It was a completely different environment than working with my peers in college. The students were excited to have something to do and just way more enthusiastic and energetic. And so I really loved what I did there. When I moved back to Chicago, I approached my old high school, Barrington, and started the program there. So I did that for 3 years now. And we've had pretty good success. This past year, we placed fourth in Overwatch in Illinois, third in Smash and League of Legends, and then we took first in Valorant. We also competed in Play Versus. We took the Central Championship for the United States, and then we placed top 8 in North America. So a little bit synopsis here of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to describe a few terms that we're going to use throughout the presentation. I'm going to talk about what to focus on as a coach, what you should be putting your time and effort into to help your students get the most out of their time. We'll talk about my kind of systematic approach and what I kind of lend a lot of my success to. And then I'll share some experiences of what I've learned in the past. Things that can kind of help you along the way, I hope. So starting with the lingo here, if you play League of Legends, you've probably heard of micro and macro. For those of you that aren't too familiar, I've kind of explained them here. So micro is what you would call like a player's mechanics. It's kind of their reaction time, their aim in shooters, their movement. In League of Legends, it's your ability usage and your positioning in team fights and all of those things. So those are your fine movements, your like motor control. And then we have macro. So in League of Legends, that's your planning. That's how you move across the map. It's kind of these overarching ideas, how well you plan and execute on those plans. So that's how, in a general sense, I'm going to use those words going forward. This is kind of how you can spread the games out between those two categories. So, for chess, for example, there is no micro, right? There's no mechanics you have to have in chess. It doesn't require skill to move the pieces. It's all about planning. Games are at the highest level planned down to a single move, and you really have to do something off your plan to confuse your opponent because they've studied plans for years, right? And then you have Smash on the other hand, which is probably the other end of the spectrum where it's almost all mechanics. You have certain matchups and maps that you pick, but you just practice. You work on your micro, your movements, your combos, everything, really fine tuning that. And then, games all in between. So kind of tactical shooters kind of fall somewhere in between. League is leaning more towards the strategy aspect and so forth. So we have these two topics, two like ideas that we can work on, but what gets the most value, right? You can only have so much time to coach your students or kind of what to work on. So this is my take. For the micro aspects, this is best for your daily warm-ups. So if you have things like aim labs for aim training, I know they're for like CSGO or Valorant or Rocket League, there are community maps, right, where you can practice your ball handling on a small scale without going into a game. For Super Smash Bros, maybe you're just hosting weeklies or maybe every 2 days at your school just so the kids can play together. In League of Legends, maybe this is playing 1v1s, ARAMs, or kind of like CSing games that you make up. But this is best handled when you kind of provide the resources to your students to improve on their own time, right? This isn't something that really needs to be collaborative aside from maybe Smash. And then on the other hand, we have macro, right? So this is the system that your team operates under. This is something collaborative that everyone needs to contribute to. And this is where the most room for improvement is, right? When you take a player who comes from just playing by themselves online, they could have great mechanics already. They could not. But the thing that they're going to have the least amount of practice doing across the board is working together, working with a unit, right? Because that's not the primary focus when you're playing by yourself or even with a few friends. So before I get into some kind of concrete examples of what that looks like in gaming, I want to describe this theory that's very common in my quality and manufacturing background. So this is the continuous improvement plan, right? It's plan, do, check, and act, right? So these are the fundamental 4 steps for any process, right? Whether it's, making pharmaceutical equipment, whether it's how to improve at playing video games, or maybe it's how to fix bad habits, whatever you're trying to do, right? This is a fundamental structure that you can rely on to try and just refine yourself over time, right? And it's easy to understand at face value. Obviously, just looking at it, it makes sense, but the implementation is what's key, right? It's what you plan, it's how you do it, it's what you're looking at when you check. And so we'll talk about that going forward. Creating a system like this from scratch is hard. So that's what I'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation. All right, and then we'll just walk through the steps on kind of what this looks like on an esports level. Right, so things that you would plan, right? So in chess, if you're familiar, right, it's openers. How you start your game is very calculated. League of Legends, how you path around the jungle, how you set up objectives. In Overwatch, maybe you have special defensive positions that you take on certain maps. In tactical shooters, you have a default where you start every round like this. You might have some set takes on a site, right? That's what your plan is. And this is the most important part of the process, and also the least important, right? The most important part is that you have a plan. This is where most teams kind of fall apart, is when, maybe it's student run, or maybe it's just kind of, you have a program that's not used to thinking about it in this way, and you absolutely need to lay out what you're going to do, right? That's the first step. So have a plan. If you don't have a plan, right, and let's say you're just playing games and you look back and review, you don't necessarily know what to look at, right? So the plan provides that basis for what we're going to go off of. Right, so next step is just doing, right? So you set up your plan. Everyone has a role. Everyone has something they're trying to achieve, a common goal for the team. And obviously, before you start, make sure everyone's on the same page, right? We're dealing with high school students. Got to make sure you get their attention, maybe explain it a few times. And then you're going to execute your plan to the best of your ability. And obviously, there's a lot of variation in these games. So something will happen that you don't plan on, but try and stick to the plan as straightforward as you can. All right, next step being check. So after the game, you can ask yourself, okay, we said we wanted to do this. Was it realistic? Was it possible to execute, right? Were we able to follow through with the plan? Was this an improvement over how we were playing before? And this is where you can kind of have a discussion with your students. Did things happen you didn't expect? Stuff like that. As a general rule of thumb, if you finish a game and there really aren't a lot of notes to give, you thought everything went well, make your plan more complex. Maybe add to it, make more details, or make it encompass a new part of the game, right? Keep expanding. And if you feel like you keep trying it and it's too hard, reel it back a little bit. Right, and then act. It's a little bit self-explanatory at this part, but now that you have feedback from your students, adjust your plan, make some clear changes on what you're going to do, and then continue to refine upon it, right? And then the goal is to have just small improvements over time, right? This isn't something that is going to change, your entire team overnight, but doing this over a whole season, you'll see improvement. So now let's talk about what this kind of looks like specifically for an esports level. So what I like to call it is kind of like your baseline plan, right? So you're going to start off with this baseline. And this is something that you're going to do for one cycle of a game, is the most general way to say it. This is something, so like in chess, right, it would be one entire match. In Valorant and CSGO, it's kind of a round. So the end goal would be to have a plan for every step along the way, start to finish, right? And obviously, that's a little bit hard. You can start small, right, and then build up to a full game, right? So I'll show an example in a little bit of like a plan for League of Legends, right, where we just do a couple minutes at a time, and eventually we expand and expand. And the most important thing you can do in setting this up is to remember that whatever you plan has to be independent of what your opponents are going to do, right? So if you're including like, okay, let's do this and this and this, if they do this, right, that if statement is something that you're not going to be able to account for every time. It's going to be really unreliable. So whenever you make a plan, try and make it independent of your opponents. There's so many variables in these games, right? You can think of it like an equation. You have constant variables, like in League, maybe there's minions and towers that do the same thing every game. You have yourselves, which you can control, but then your opponents are the only random variables, right? So you need to make a plan that kind of limits the random variables. This is a example of what it would look like in League of Legends. So here we have, a plan from the start of the game to when crab spawns, right? So our plan is we're going to have the top laner pull his wave at the start of the game so that it'll slow push into him. Our jungler will path towards bot side. And then when he shows up on the bot crab, our support's going to get early vision. Our mid laner is going to move in and cover him as well so that we guarantee ourselves bot crab, right? And I'll have a little example of this in a second, but this is just a nice way to break it down for your students, right? You have a clear goal, right? We're going to show up at the crab fight with this many people doing this, and each student has something that they can contribute to individually, right? So this is what you would look back at when you're reviewing. You could look at each point and say, okay, we're at this wave, is this what was happening? Were you not able to make it happen? Is it not possible? Questions like that, right? So I know that looking at a spreadsheet is not as exciting. So this is what the map movements would look like, right? So you can visualize it a little bit better. Right, so as the game goes on, this is kind of how it plays out. And right, so this is just the first 3 minutes and 15 seconds of the game. But having consistency, right? So my team is doing this every single game. And what that allows us to do, if we're extremely consistent in ourselves, is you're able to better identify what those random variables are, right? So what your opponents are doing. Your players will become more comfortable recognizing like when they're stronger, right? Or, if an opponent is caught out, they'll be able to see things like that quicker. They'll be more confident in what they're doing and making split-second decisions because everything else is kind of standard. So that's your baseline plan, right? That was only a short amount of what it would look like. But obviously, doing the same thing every game doesn't sound realistic, right? How do you deal with variance? How do you deal with these random opponents? It's going to be different every game, right? There's an infinite number of solutions, but there's only two kind of states that a game can be in, right? So every game starts off neutral, and once something happens, you either come out ahead or you're behind in the game, right? So you establish your baseline, and now we're going to establish kind of a guideline on how we react to both of these situations. So some examples of that, right? So let's say it's League of Legends and we're playing around dragons, right? So every 5 minutes is kind of that baseline. We're going to set up for dragon, but now we're behind. How do we do that? Well, we set up a condition where now instead of setting up vision in river, we're going to set it up on our quadrant of the jungle, and we're just going to hold our side defensively, right? Or let's say you're ahead, right? Now we're going to put vision deep in the enemy jungle and catch them out before they even have a chance to set up their dragon, right? Things like that. Let's say, in Valorant, you do your default, everyone's holding a position and a teammate gets a pick, right? Now you can play a little bit slower and you can try and work out the best place to hit. Or if you start falling behind really quick, you need to group up and you have to hit a site fast with your man advantage before the enemy team can react, right? So you're going to kind of set up guidelines. And this has been extremely helpful because something that I've noticed in students or just any kind of competitive setting is that players tend to react the opposite way of what needs to be happening. So what I mean by that is, let's say your team gets a lead, right? And their natural reaction then would be maybe they play a little sloppier, they get confident, they get cocky, and it's more, it's riskier. They end up making more mistakes when they're ahead, right? And the opposite would be when teams fall behind, they tend to shut down. And these are actually the opposite of what needs to happen, right? So when your team's ahead, you've already gained a lead. You need to either just systematically kind of close out the game, right? Or you need to just kind of maintain your lead, right? In a game like chess, that's more strategic. Once you gain an advantage in pieces, you can win out the game there 100% unless you make a mistake, right? But if you're behind, and this is something that I worked with my Overwatch team a lot, and League of Legends team too, but if you're behind, you tend to shut down. And what needs to happen is you have to go into overdrive, right? So if you're behind, you need to pick up the pace. You need to think of new ways. You need to get to something quicker than your opponent. You need to do something that is kind of off the books or off the chart, right? Something that needs to like catapult you back into the lead. So having these systems in place, having a set plan of saying, when we're behind, we do this. It doesn't let your students shut down, because instead of thinking, oh, we're behind, now what? They think, oh, we're behind. Okay, now we do this, right? So one last kind of thing about reacting to like variance in games. Obviously, it's great to have plans, but things are going to change all the time. There's going to be different opponents and all that. So having a steady baseline plan, everything that someone's on the same page about, right? Your baseline plan doesn't really need to be communicated much after you guys have rehearsed it so much. Now you're able to use what I like to call binary communication very well. So that's, setting up these if-then statements, right? So you have your base plan, but your students are able to say, if this happens, then we can do this, right? They're anticipating enemy actions because they already know what they're doing, right? The only thing they have to worry about is what their opponents are doing, right? And setting this up enables you to, react faster when it does happen, but it also sets up a plan for after it happens, right? So everything is a lot more fluid if you can set up statements like this and get everyone on the same page. Maybe a small example would be, let's say, on a smaller scale, you have a Malphite on your team, right? And you're doing Baron, and your teammate says, if their AD carry walks up, then I'll ult them, right? So Malphite ult would target the AD carry. So now your teammates aren't just waiting to react off of Malphite. They're actually looking at the enemy AD carry, and they know what Malphite's going to do. So now they can position to follow up, right? You're already one step ahead. So this is something that I really like to stress as well with my students. Even kind of, if you're not able to set up a plan, just using if-then statements in your communication is a really good way to kind of piece things together. So these are some kind of things that I've run into during my time coaching that I think are really important. The first one, when a measurement becomes the goal, it ceases to become a good measurement. So how I was talking to my brother-in-law about this, who's a manager at a restaurant, and he had like a good example that I like to use now. So let's say you're a small restaurant, right? And your selling point is that you have good service and you're quick at getting food out, right? Well, that's awesome. That's great. You can continue and work towards that goals, do little things to kind of improve yourself. But let's say you set your new goal, right? Now it's let's get food out in 10 minutes, right? 10 minutes is the goal, right? Everything is to get food out in 10 minutes, which is really quick. But now let's say, it's 9 minutes, 45 seconds, and the manager's over your shoulder, right? Maybe the cook undercooks something or sends something out messy, right? You're going to work towards that metric and start sacrificing things just to achieve that metric. So I like that example. And what that kind of looks like in esports is maybe an example with my students was for League of Legends, I told them that every time they died, they'd be doing push-ups, 10 push-ups to death. So what the game turned out to be is that they stood under their towers, they conceded every objective, they never fought, and they didn't end up doing push-ups aside from one or two of them. So I guess they achieved the goal, but setting that metric didn't help. So that's kind of I like that one right there. The key to long-term success is accepting boredom. This one is tough because in my experience, students play games for a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe they play for fun, maybe they're naturally competitive, or maybe, they play games as an escape from whatever they're dealing with, or who knows. But getting students who use the game as an escape maybe, or just like having fun and trying to get them into a system and get them to do something more structured in their game time has been a challenge. You really need to think about setting small incentives or kind of dealing with each student on an individual basis on how you approach things like this. That's something that's actually been a struggle, I guess, for me, is trying to get everyone to buy into a system. Standardize before you optimize. A lot of teams, especially if you watch professional games, are concerned about the meta, right? Constantly trying to follow what the pros are doing. And I think at some point that is helpful. But if you're just starting off, or if you're competing at a general high school level, standardize before you optimize, right? Have a system in place that your students can work on and improve, kind of like I talked about before. And that's going to be more beneficial than playing a specific champion or hero, right? The only time that those fine optimizations really matter is when you're getting to those higher levels, when you play people at even skill and even organization to you, right? If you come out there in your games and you have a plan and you execute your plan, you're already setting the pace for the game, right? And then the last one is just to start simple. If you're a small program, like I said before, or you're just relatively new to approaching the games like this, don't overdo it. Don't stress yourself out. Just create something for your students to do every game. And then obviously the earlier you start, the better. Something that I've run into is, once you get to playoffs, once you get to high stakes matches, it's really hard to convince people that we should be trying new things, that we should constantly be redefining ourselves. Once you get to those playoffs, those high stakes matches, you really tend to fall back on what's worked in the past. So that's my advice to you aspiring coaches out there. So just a little bit of summary. The kind of definition of macro in a computer sense is one that I really like. That kind of describes what I'm laying out here. A single instruction that expands automatically into a set of instructions to perform a particular task, right? So you're laying out a single plan that helps your students throughout the entire game to achieve victory, right? That's kind of what that would translate to for this presentation, right? So that means you create your baseline, you create a plan from when you're ahead, a plan from when you're behind, and then you just constantly try and improve it, right? You plan, you do it, you check, review, and then you act on those comments. So the last thing, kind of a little visual that I like to think about. It's kind of like Legos, right? You present like this cool, flashy idea. Maybe it's how a professional team plays that you follow, or maybe, it's an idea you came up yourself, but you present this idea, right? And then you just have to start breaking it down, right, into components, right? You break it down into the tiny pieces, and then you assemble it, right? And you start at the base. So that's all I had in the presentation. If anyone has any questions, if anyone's in the chat or wants me to reiterate on some things, I guess I've got a little bit of time left. Yeah, it's kind of up to you guys. If anyone wants me to expand on something or reiterate, I'm happy to. All right. So Steven is asking, when you're starting out, how do you balance setting up a system to follow versus iterating and improving? So I think, So I think you're asking, how do you balance, as in like with time management maybe? So how do you, right, you only have so many hours, like, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So the process can be really slow. I think as a coach, when you go into your first couple practices, um, you have a plan, right? Something like, um, go back. Did I skip it? Right, something like this that you can lay out for your students and show them. Right, this is what you're going to do, and this right here is actually, I watched. If you're familiar with League, I watched a lot of the World Championship. I watched a lot of Dom One, and I kind of tracked what each player was doing to some extent, and I created this plan. Right, and like I said, this is for the first 3 minutes 15 seconds. So um, I would present them with this. We kind of practice it in different ways, maybe. Right, some of them we could play 15-minute games and just forfeit as soon as it hits 15, as soon as we can, and go over this. You can kind of do little different, like those micro sessions I talked about, right? If there's an issue with doing the same thing over and over again, maybe you can add in an incentive, right? So, like I said, we played, my team basically had the first 15 minutes of the game planned out on what they would do. And I would tell them, okay, now let's set a record, right? Let's see how much gold we can get. How much of a lead can we have in those 15 minutes, right? So that gives the players something to work to, right? And it gives them a reason to keep refining this. So if you can find those little incentives along the way, it helps with like the boredom. And then you can also kind of break it up. You can have the students get involved with planning, right? If you have a student who's a little bit of a tactician, present something like this to them and get their thoughts and get their input, and maybe they can help motivate the students. Does that kind of address that, Stephen? Awesome. Yeah, if there's any other questions, I'm hanging out for another 13 minutes, it looks like. Hope I didn't talk too fast. I'll give it a minute or two here before I hang up the mic, but appreciate everyone who hung around and listened to the presentation. I very much, like talking about this and love supporting high school esports and love getting involved. And I'm sure all the rest of you do too. So I'm looking forward to the upcoming season and all that. All right. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up here then. Yeah. No, you're welcome, Brad. Thanks. Yeah. No, thank you guys for listening. It's an honor to be able to present and share my, point of view with you guys. Thank you. I know my wife took that last weekend. Yeah, it's a good picture. That's why I had to be in here. Thanks, Andy. All right. Yeah, I'm going to wrap this up so that, you guys can try and catch the tail end of the other sessions. That's what I'm going to hop in and do. So I appreciate everyone's time, and thanks for listening. If you have any other questions, you can DM me here, or my Discord's on the screen, but you should be able to find me somewhere. So thanks very much.